Welcome to For the Record. On this program, we talk about events and issues that affect the people of Sudbury. Very much in the news right now is the Proposition 2.5 override that people are going to be asked to vote on March 27. Since there seem to be a lot of questions in the minds of people as to just what Proposition 2.5 is, what do we mean by an override? How is it going to affect us? I've asked our town treasurer, Chester Hamilton, to be with me today on this program to explain some of these differences to you and the impact it's going to have. Chet, we hear a lot about Proposition 2.5, but I wonder if there aren't some people who may have moved to Massachusetts who aren't even aware of just what do we mean by 2.5 to begin with. Can you give us a little bit about that background?
Well, if they moved here from California, they'd probably be somewhat familiar with it because our Proposition 2.5 is probably an outgrowth of the Proposition 13 in California, which was also a tax-limiting kind of referenda question. In I believe it was 1981, Massachusetts adopted the same kind of legislation. And very broadly and very generally, what it says is that property taxes in a given year can't increase in total more than 2.5% of the assessed valuation of property, plus allowances for things like new construction. And essentially, every year now, our tax base is established from the prior year. To that, we add 2.5% of that total value, and to that, we also add new construction. And that limits the amount that we can raise by taxation.
Okay, now we brought this into Massachusetts on a referendum.
That is correct.
So that everybody voted on adopting
that is correct.
Proposition 2.5. So sometimes it's a little helpful to talk specifics. And since I understand that $300,000 is about the median value of a house in Sudbury, when you say my taxes can't increase more than 2.5%, can you give me some of the numbers that might go with this $300,000 home?
Some of the problem there is the fact that for an individual home, it can, in fact, increase more than 2.5%. It's the total taxes to be raised for the town as a whole that cannot go up more than 2.5%. But in general, the taxes on a $300,000 home would fall within this range. And so 2.5% of, 2.5% of 300, sounds like it ought to be about $75. Does that work out to something?
That would be the
increase. That would be the
on
increase
the current tax.
on the current tax.
Okay, now we are also dealing with two different factors over here as I read about the requests for us to go over the 2.5 budget. Some of the numbers are coming out to an increase of $1.89 million. Some of the numbers are coming out to over $2 million. In some cases, we're being asked for an override. A year ago, we were being asked for an exemption to 2.5. Could you tell us the difference between overriding 2.5 and exempting something from 2.5?
The technical difference is the fact that on an override, that sum of money which is approved by an override becomes a permanent part of the levy. And instead of the next year being limited to a 2.5% increase, the override, in this case we're talking, let's say, $1.9 million, would become a permanent part of our levy, and the whole levy would be increased by $1.9 million. The death exemption is limited by the term of the borrowing. And quite frankly, if you're talking in terms of 20-year borrowing, the difference between an override and a death exemption, as far as its impact on the taxes in my lifetime, is a very Tweedledee and Tweedledum kind of thing. At the end of the 20 years, the death exemption would disappear. But I think by 20 years from now, I will disappear too.
Okay, so although there is a technical difference, the impact on the taxpayer really doesn't seem to change an awful lot.
It does not.
Because of the length of the exemption period. So as you say, if you're paying for this exemption over the course of 20 years, that's, let's call it semi-permanent.
That's going to be with us for a while.
But that still is a good
Absolutely.
length of time to do this. Now, a lot of us voted for 2.5, of course, because we wanted to put a cap on property taxes. So how did this override and exemption come about to begin with? Here we've had a referendum that says we'll limit it to 2.5.
Well, the original legislation provided for overrides and exemptions. And the theory that I think was involved is that the people in the individual communities ought to have an opportunity, if they so desired, to increase beyond the 2.5% limit. The original vote required to do that was a 2/3 vote to have a debt override, to have an override of the levy limit. That's now a majority vote. But again, I believe the feeling was probably that while the limit put on by 2.5 were realistic and desirable, there were going to be occasions when the people in the individual community might feel, as Sudbury is addressing right today, can we live within this limit? Shouldn't there be some way that we can go beyond that limit? And that's the situation we found ourselves in. And it was the original 2.5 legislation.
Okay, so it was an escape hatch, so to speak.
Exactly.
So that you were not limited to the 2.5 if, in fact, you felt there may be an emergency, for instance.
Correct.
Okay, now on this 2.5 override that we have been asked to talk about, a certain percentage of that would go to the schools. A certain percentage of that override would be for all the rest of the town operations. Is there a breakdown on this? Do we know how much of it would be involved if we voted for the schools override?
Well, two things I'd like to respond to. One, the answer is quickly yes, and I'll get back to that in a second. And secondly is the fact that Sudbury chose to combine the operating budget override into a single override vote, unlike Wellesley, for example, which decided that they would have, I believe they had 4 separate votes. And it was basically on a departmental line. So there's nothing that says you can't do it that way, and there's nothing that says you can't do it the way Sudbury's doing. Each one is perfectly permissible. In Sudbury's case, combining the two somewhat beclouds the issue, in my opinion, because it does bring together the whole impact of the school, which is, based on the figures given at the public hearing the other evening, the school's portion of the override is about $1.6 million, or almost 86% of the total. The public safety, the highway, the library is really the small portion of this, because out of the $1.9 million, if $1.6 million is for the schools, only $300,000 is for those left over.
Okay, so in a sense, let's say somebody like me who might feel that particular departments needed this more than others, I haven't got an option now of saying I want to give this override to the rest of the town in order to let them run their operation properly. I have to do an all or nothing.
That is correct. You either have to defeat this and then hopefully have it brought back in a divided kind of override vote, or you defeat the whole thing and the schools and the public safety and those all go down together.
So to a point, if I wanted to know exactly what was going where, from my point of view as a citizen taxpayer, I would rather have the override broken down into the different departments so I would be able to make a better judgment.
That is the way Wellesley approached it, and I'm sure you get arguments on both sides of the issue. I happen to agree that in my situation I would think that is a better approach. But and the reason I think of that is, again, going back to 2.5, part of the reason and part of the result of 2.5 was the expanding budget, just almost beyond control, caused, in the opinion of many people, by the fact the school departments had what was then called fiscal autonomy.
Yes,
and it simply meant that if the schools wanted X number of dollars, they got it, or they would take you to court.
Which happened here in Sudbury.
Which happened here in Sudbury, absolutely. And so I think part of that restraint from 2.5 was clearly motivated by the burgeoning school budget. And that, in effect, is what this particular kind of override vote gives you. You're right back on that school situation override.
So you almost have a situation of they've got their autonomy back again, only in a different avenue.
That could certainly be said, yes.
Because we do have to face the fact that certain town operations are for the entire town. In other words, everybody uses the police, everybody uses the fire department, everybody gets their roads plowed by the highway department. Not everybody has children in school. So the breakdown of the two would really give you a better picture of what is going where.
And, of course, to be perfectly frank, Mary Jane, this also begins to get somewhat divisive, I guess, because people will say, if that's your approach, then you must have a dislike or a lack of sympathy for or a misunderstanding of the schools. And that is a fact of life which has to be dealt with, too.
Well, I could say the same thing about people who don't vote for the police and fire department. I'm not sympathetic to the police and fire,
I cannot quarrel with that.
Sure, it could go in in both ways.
Yeah.
Well, let's take me as Jane citizen, and let me take the $300,000 house again. What's the increase in my taxes if we do this override? We have last year's exemption that we haven't paid for yet, as I understand it. That's about to come on. We have revaluation coming in. And we also have, don't we have a second override with the senior citizens coming in there?
Well, the debt exemption vote.
A debt exemption
Back to
vote.
that.
Okay, you see, if I'm having trouble sorting all of these things out, I'm sure that a lot of my
Let me see if I can.
other citizens are having a problem.
I'm the world's poorest artist. Next to singing, I do artwork worst of all. But
well, sometimes the visual is
I've tried to put some figures together here, and one thing I want to make clear, first off, is this average $300,000 home. A lot of people may not understand that that average $300,000 home is after our current revaluation. It doesn't mean that your house today is a $300,000 home and this is going to be the impact. It really means that your house today is in the range of $150,000 to $160,000 because the values in total are roughly, and this is very rough, are roughly going to double. That means that the current tax rate, of course, is going to drop significantly from the present 1726, I believe. But I really don't want to talk about tax rates. What's really important is what is the impact on me who, after revaluation, is going to own a home of roughly $300,000. Okay,
and this $300,000 home after revaluation now relates to somebody owning a $150,000 home, more or less.
150, 160, in that range, and that may not be precise.
Okay, so I have that to worry about in addition.
You have that to think about. I don't have to worry about it. In any event, that house today, on average, if we stick with the $300,000 after revaluation or the $150,000 so pre-revaluation, that home now has a tax rate and is paying taxes of about $2,156. And these are the fiscal years I'm going to be talking about.
Okay, so we're starting with fiscal year 88.
We're starting with fiscal year 88, which is over and done with.
And
we are now in the first half of fiscal 89.
All right.
And I hope most people realize that tax bills come out twice a year. We've had the first half bill, which is a preliminary bill, and that merely means that in almost all cases that bill was one half of your last year's total bill. A problem which people haven't yet recognized, and it's not going to be a huge one, is that in the past when taxes have gone up, you've had that up split in two pieces, the first half bill and the second half bill. This year you'll get all of the increase, whatever it may be, in the second half.
That will be the spring.
That'll be the spring bill, which is estimated to come out around the 1st of June.
Okay, so the bill that we got in November did not reflect the increase.
That is correct.
So therefore, I'm going to have to start saving now.
You're going to have to save for all of what would normally be split over.
For the entire
But again, that increase is estimated to be, and this is, it is an estimate. I want everybody to know this is not gospel.
Sure.
It is estimated to be roughly 5%.
Of the current
taxes.
bill.
So that means that your bill this year, if the 5% is within striking distance of being right, would increase from $21.56 to $22.64, or an increase of something like that. All right? So that's what your tax bill would be, roughly for 89, because none of this override, none of these exemption questions really have impacted as yet. This is essentially a somewhat normal tax increase. And let me interrupt just a second here to talk about these people who say, my tax bill, I've been in Sudbury for several years, and my tax bill hasn't gone up. And you know what? They're right. It hasn't gone up significantly. I think my own tax bill in the last 3 years has gone up, let's say, $75. And why? Because of something people hear about and really don't appreciate, and that's all these windfalls we've had. They have kept that tax rate from going up. We are playing out of windfalls. And so...
Is this free cash money that we've been using, for instance?
A lot of it's accounting, it's better tax collection, it's the treatment of abatement surpluses, it's an accounting gimmick that the state adopted, all kinds of little nuisances. But anyway, our increase for this year obviously carries forward for the next 3 years. It's now part of your base.
Okay.
It's part of your base.
All right, so now my 2.5 base is up to here.
Your 2.5 base is up to here. Now the fun begins. Because I think we've got to assume there's going to be, as there always has been, there's going to be a normal increase in expenses. Salaries go up, costs go up, expenses go up. And as a guess, and an estimate based on information I've tried to put together somewhat intelligently, that increase is going to be in the neighborhood of $800,000. That's if we don't override, we don't do a thing. If you look in your warrant and see what the FinCom's non-override budget is, you'll find that just life being what it is, expenses are going to go up. And they are going to go up roughly $800,000. And that, on our average home, is roughly $155 per household.
Okay, this is without any overrides at all.
This is without any override, any exemption, anything. It's just the normal increase of expenses.
Okay.
In the past, that $800,000 has been fairly constant, and it has not impacted you because we've had free cash, we've had abatement surpluses, we've had accounting changes approved by the state. It's been there, but we haven't been impacted by it. We haven't seen it as far as our tax rate's concerned.
Is this like rich uncle giving you a birthday present
Absolutely.
to meet your bills?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the rich uncle has died and left it all to his rich wife now. In addition to that, we begin to pick up the first portion of the Lincoln Sudbury debt, which we exempted. This is where your exempted thing starts to come in.
This was last year's.
This was last year's debt exemption on Lincoln Sudbury. We also had a debt exemption on the K through 8 for the design of the school. We'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
But the Lincoln Sudbury has actually borrowed, and this year in fiscal 90, they will be paying debt principal and debt interest on the they had a $750,000 debt exemption. They are starting to pay that off.
All right, so we haven't even paid on that one yet. We are now starting to pay on that one.
It'll hit fiscal 90 for the first time.
In addition to my $800,000 addition.
Yep. We now have a payment on the first payment on the LS debt.
All right, so
that'll
that has
add
to get
about
added on.
$26 more.
Okay.
We also have the first really interest payment only on the debt borrowing in connection with the architect and design fees for the school system.
Now,
that's also $750,000, but we haven't permanently borrowed, so all we're doing now on that is paying interest. The LS is real debt. We've borrowed. The LS is borrowed. They have a debt outstanding which they are repaying.
All right, are these the designs?
Totally lost you, haven't I?
Yes, you have. See, and if you've lost me, I'm afraid you're going to be losing some of my fellow and sister citizens here. That money that we voted for the architect's planning, wasn't that the money that we were depending on state aid for, and now we're not going to get state aid?
In part, yes, but the real thing they were planning on state aid was for the actual construction. The design fees would have become reimbursable, but it was not contemplated at the beginning that would really impact the decision on whether to borrow for that or not. The real impact of the state aid from the school building is that it has been withdrawn for the building. And that's a 64% reimbursement. That's very significant. And when that disappeared, the plans, at least temporarily, got blown out of the water.
So the plans that we paid for
can't
be used?
No, that's
the plan, because
they are still proceeding with the design because they still hope to go ahead and build the Dixon School area and whatever else. So the architect fee is still there. Money's been borrowed to do it, and money's been spent for services actually rendered.
All right, so that has to be added on
that
to
has
what
to be
we're going
added
to be paying.
too, and that isn't as significant as the LS debt because we have only the interest portion, and that's roughly $8.
Okay.
We go on to the possible exemption on the Council on Aging, Fairbanks School renovation. If that passes, the impact this year will add about $6.
Okay.
And if the debt override, the operating budget override passes, we have this wonderful figure of $379.
Just for
Just for that alone.
override alone.
Alone.
And that's the override we're going to be voting on
That is
March
correct.
27.
And so if you add all those things together, instead of being told that it's only going to cost you $379 next year, according to my figures, it's really going to cost you $574, or an increase of 25% for next year.
All right, so if I wanted to get a feel for how much more I'm going to be paying next year, I would take my tax bill that I get in the spring and add 25% to that tax
Yes, ma'am.
bill.
Yes, ma'am.
No, I've got to add
No, you have
25% to the
Well, I'm
fall and spring, don't I?
No, if you get the spring bill, that will include whatever regular operating budget increases, normal, regular. So if you want to get what your fiscal 90 bill might be, if the override passes and if the debt exemption passes, you would add 25% to the bill you will get. The bill you'll get in spring will show the total bill, and that the estimate or preliminary bill you paid will be subtracted from it. But
All
on
right,
that bill
all
you
right.
get in June, you will have the figure.
I will show
what
my
your-
total year's
You will show
figure.
what your
I
total
don't just
fiscal,
show half.
you will show
Okay.
what your total fiscal 89
Okay.
tax is.
So that's what I have to do, is not the bill that I'm going to pay in the spring,
No,
which is only
no,
half.
because you've paid some
But
of it.
if I take my entire total and add 25% to it, that tells me what my new tax bill,
In my opinion,
It's gonna
you'll
be close, at
You'll be
least.
coming very close.
to what my new tax bill is going
And
to
so
be.
this little fellow down here has now become plus that and plus that. And since overrides and debt exemptions go on, they become a permanent part of your tax base for the next 2 years. I can't go on that.
So
the
now
next-
my 2.5 is
So now your
base is
2.5
way up to here
becomes
somewhere.
No, in the debt exemption does not figure into your 2.5 calculation.
Right.
But when you're paying taxes, it does figure in. And that's what you're more concerned about, I think, than
Well, this is what I'm trying to do, is get a handle on, if I, am big-time Charlie, and I say, oh, great, we'll override everything and we'll give all of these, then I have to face the fact that I will be paying 25% higher
next year,
taxes
in
next
fiscal
year.
90.
And then, of course, that brings me into the following years, which,
And it keeps these
Gonna keep
these
going
things
on
you've
up.
approved keep adding in, because in the fiscal 91 year, we get a little relief. It only goes up about $300. Again, a portion of that is the normal budgetary increase in expenses, which we've always had, and which for many years have been greatly reduced as far as impact by the free cash and the available funds and the wonderful things we've been able to do, which we don't have anymore.
in other
So
words,
you've
we've
got-
used up all of
You've
our...
got some of that increase.
gift
There's
money,
just
so to
no way to
speak.
avoid by anything else. But on the other hand, you then start to pick up the LS debt, the actual principal and interest debt on the design fees, and the Council on Aging principal and interest. And so you now have a total for 1991, an increase of about $300, 11% over what
Again.
you paid in fiscal 90. So we got things like that. And of course, that doesn't go away.
Okay, so
And so for fiscal 92, you've got a base that starts there. Once these things are in, they just don't,
in other words, let me just do this over here, that each time I have added figures over here, that now has become my
Yes,
new
ma'am.
base all
Yes,
the way
ma'am.
along the
Yep.
line.
and to that, we're adding these new expenses.
So I have almost lost my Prop 2.5 value, if you want to call it that.
Almost.
I might just as well not have Prop 2.5 giving me a
And
property.
then, just to really bring this to a final bit here, in 92, you again have the normal budgetary increases.
Okay, let me do it this way.
Right. In 92,
To,
you'll have the normal budgetary increases. And in 92, you begin to pick up for the first time the cost of the new building program if the override passes, because they plan to open the school in the fall of 91, as I understand it. And so you pick up,
Okay.
in that year, you begin to pick up the debt for that project, and you also begin to pick up something that's never been talked of, the cost of staffing and maintaining that school, which you voted to build. And those increases, I estimate, based on figures put out by the school department and my own knowledge of the debt, you will then increase your taxes that year by $480. And it could be 475, mind you.
Sure.
Don't
No,
hold me to that,
I-
but
I appreciate the fact that we can't,
It's
yeah,
a good
get,
jump.
Get
And
right
so
down
where you
to-
end then, having started with 1988's tax on a $300,000 home of $2,156, we are now up to, I can't write backwards.
No, I don't.
We are now up to,
Yeah.
I don't know how that's going to show it now, we are now up to 3,620, or over the period of time, an increase of 60% in your taxes.
By the time I have reached
By the time you've reached fiscal
fiscal year
92,
92,
you have increased from your 1988 base, you have increased 60% in taxes. Now, that's the situation that people have to consider when they, and I appreciate there are a great many people who say there is no price too great to pay.
okay.
And there are
that's,
some people who say, I simply
I
can't
can't
afford
make it.
I can't
you
make
know,
it.
What's our history right now, Chet, as far as people paying their current taxes?
Well, I hate to give publicity to anything, but if you read today's local newspaper, you'll see that there are about 90 parcels listed in what we call advertised for tax title taking. That means there are those numbers of parcels that people have not paid their taxes on. This is a partial advertising for the fiscal year 88. Currently, and somewhat discouragingly as far as I'm concerned, we have about 300 parcels owned, and I'm excluding the brokers and the land developers and that kind of thing, who normally don't pay their taxes until they sell the parcel. But excluding them, we have about 300 parcels on which taxes are still due for the current first half of this fiscal year.
All right, so these are people who have been, we guess, unable to pay their taxes
I
as
wish
they
I knew what
stand
the
now.
answers were. We have corresponded with them. We've advised each one of them that the taxes were due. They haven't paid it.
We don't know the history of
I know there are
why,
some cases
yeah.
because they've come into the office and talked to people who simply, honest to goodness, can't afford it. There are people living in expensive homes who have lost a job temporarily or something like that situation and are on financial hard times. And I'm sure there are a great many people who say there are things that I would rather do with my money than pay taxes. And well, I have to. I can't help but feel that way.
How do you manage that one? I mean,
Well, I don't know, but that's all I can assume. I'm sure it runs the gamut from those who really seriously have a problem.
so it could be a variety of reasons why they're not paying it. I guess maybe I'm being subjective and thinking the reason they don't pay it is because they don't have the money to pay it, that nobody says that they don't have to pay
And as I said,
the town tax.
these
think.
people have been reminded. It's not a case of they've forgotten or they didn't get the bill or something like that, because each and every one of us we sent a notice to reminded that that preliminary bill was a valid bill. It is accrued interest at 14% if not paid, and it had the full force and effect of an actual tax bill.
Okay, so what happens now? It goes into tax title, it gets advertised, then it goes to...
No, we advertise first, and then 14
Okay.
days after the advertisement, we put them in the so-called tax set, which means filing a document with the registry showing that the town's lien is a valid one, and these are the facts, and these are the properties involved. 6 months after that, we can begin to foreclose on these properties, which means that we advise, and there are documents prepared to file in land court, and it's a long, slow process to work its way through there. But the town could eventually foreclose on the property and sell it in order to recover the taxes and interest due.
Okay, so nobody gets to the point where they can say, I'm just not going to pay my taxes.
Well, they can say that, but they're going to have somebody knocking on the door one of these times, I hope.
They can say that only if they don't intend to live in that particular
correct.
house
That is correct.
anymore. Well, we have been trying today with our treasurer, Chet Hamilton, to give you a realistic picture of what happens when you vote for a 2.5 override, what the difference is between the override and the exemption, what has been the impact of our past votes at town meeting last year, and what will be the impact on revaluation. It's been a confusing subject to me, and I've been in this town a long time. I hope some of the questions have been answered, because everything you have heard today is for the record.